Here to guide us into the mysterious world of Amazon keywords is Erica Leeman, the Metadata Associate at the MIT Press. Erica is in charge of educating the press about the importance of metadata and establishing best practices to help the MIT Press become a more metadata-informed publisher. With a Master of Library and Information Sciences from Simmons College, she is now bringing her LIS experience to the metadata challenges within scholarly publishing. Please welcome Erica.
So I'm going to talk today about demystifying the inner workings of Amazon keywords, but before I really get into it, I want to start by defining keywords because that seems sort of mandatory for any presentation about keywords, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page. This is the definition given by the Book Industry Study Group. They say that a keyword is a word or phrase that describes the content or theme of a book product that is relevant to the work and used to supplement consumer-facing display data. So basically, it just is a word or phrase that tells you what a book is about. Keywords, they function behind the scenes, so they're not displayed to the consumer in almost any case, but they are a really highly ranked field for determining relevance and determining search results. The main incentive for using keywords right now is better discoverability on Amazon. Amazon is the retailer that everybody cares about. Most consumers use Amazon, and because of that, they make up a huge portion of sales for almost every publisher today. So I'm here today to tell you everything that Amazon won't tell you about keywords. Using specific examples from the MIT Press, I'm going to talk about what works and what doesn't work, and I'm going to give you sort of additional best practices and tips and tricks for dealing with keywords specific to Amazon. I'm not going to talk about the BISG best practices in detail, and I'm going to assume some level of familiarity with those and build on that. And if anybody just realized that they don't want to be here, I think now's probably your time to leave. So to start off, I wanted to talk a little bit more about myself, although I did get a very thorough introduction. I do have a master's in library and information science from Simmons, go Sharks, and my background is mainly in cataloging and metadata for libraries. I started at the MIT Press last June, and that was my first entry into the world of publishing. So it's been a really fun transition for me to bring everything that I know about libraries and sort of try to apply that to the many, many issues that publishers are facing with metadata right now. And hiring a metadata associate was also sort of the MIT Press's first foray into mindful metadata management because it was a new position that they had created to fill a growing need they observed. And a lot of what I do as the metadata associate is sort of what Joshua Talent was talking about. I'm not a single person that manages all of the metadata. My job consists more of creating an inclusive culture for everyone to get involved in the metadata. So I have a hand in creating workflows that span the entire press, and then educating various departments about those workflows and about best practices. For anybody here who is not familiar with the MIT Press, we are a university press located in Cambridge, Massachusetts, associated with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. We have a list based in science and technology, but we publish in fields as various as art to physics to physical sciences, political science. We cover a lot of fields. And as we continue to publish in new and emerging fields, it's really important that our books are discoverable to audiences who may not be aware of us or aware of what our list can offer them. And keywords are a great step toward that kind of awareness. So the press first started to think about keywords a year ago, last March. They had a metadata summit, and out of that, they developed a metadata challenge based on the original Nielsen white paper on keywords. And the challenge was to take 50 backlist books and enhance their metadata and see what the impact was on sales for those. So the committee came together and they chose the books, and part of my first project at the press in June was when they were finalizing their enhanced metadata, and I sort of collected that and coalesced it. They chose the books. They were a variety of disciplines, and they were a variety of trade and professional titles. They were all published between 2009 and 2015, so they were a relatively recent backlist. They were chosen based on whether they had an ebook for one thing to increase sales, and also a big criteria was they chose books that were underperforming based on expectations for their sales, the reasoning being that those books had the most to gain from this kind of experiment. So these 50 titles that the committee chose were the first MIT Press books ever to have keywords. And like I said, my first project was to collect those keywords, and as part of that, I started doing research on keywords, and I found out that Amazon is the only major retailer right now accepting and using keywords. And since Amazon makes up more than half of our domestic sales, I was incredibly interested in knowing how Amazon was using the keywords so that we could make them as successful as possible. But I found nothing. Amazon does provide guidelines on their website for Kindle Direct Publishing, which allows authors 7 keywords for their ebooks, but I didn't find any information for publishers providing keywords via an Onyx feed. Amazon is famously opaque about everything that they do, and keywords are just no different than that, so no one really seemed to know what they were doing. The most helpful resource I found was the blog on Kadaxis's website, which Joshua Talent mentioned. Kadaxis, they're a tech company that uses machine learning to gather insights about books and about publishing, primarily using manuscripts and audience data. They have a blog that unfortunately has been dormant for quite a while now, but it does include a few good posts about keywords, including information for publishers. And so I put a link up here to my favorite post from them. If these slides become available later, you'll be able to get that, but a quick Google search will also get you there, I'm sure. It's also worth mentioning, Kadaxis partnered recently with Firebrand Technologies, who's Joshua Talent we just heard from, and he talked a little bit about this study they've done, which is still ongoing, about the impact of keywords on discoverability and sales. And what they found overall is that keywords do have a very positive impact on sales, and that was also the finding of the Nielsen white papers. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time convincing you guys that keywords are worth doing. I'm going to assume that everyone in this room believes in keywords and believes that we should do keywords. But at the end of my presentation, I will talk a little bit about the impact that we saw on sales for these 50 books. So going back to Amazon, I was trying to figure out how they were using keywords, and I wasn't finding the information that I really wanted. I wasn't finding nearly enough information. So I got it in my head, the great idea to take these 50 books and their newly minted keywords and use those as a test set to figure it out for myself. So the first step of that was to collect and analyze and edit the members of the committee's keywords that they gave to me for these books. I started off by trying to align them with the BISG best practices, but that didn't answer every question that I had. Like basically everything in life, keywords are done differently by different people, and I had keywords from 12 different people, so I was already having a lot of questions about the best way to do something. For example, is it better to repeat a word across multiple phrases or to break a phrase apart into its component words? What about singular versus plural? And should you use all of the prefix and suffix forms, or do you only need to include a base form of a word? And how many different ways do you really need to say America? These are the kinds of questions that nobody really had the answers to, even Kadaxis, and I didn't want to have to just make blind guesses about it. So I made notes of titles and keywords for these books that I wanted to monitor on Amazon. I put them in our title management system, and they went out in our next Onyx feed. Once they were in Amazon, I did keyword searches for all 50 books, trying to answer these questions, but also just trying to determine that Amazon was successfully ingesting them without any major issues, and also trying to determine how the keywords were impacting discoverability. So my first priority was just to make sure that the keywords were actually being read by Amazon's search engine, and to do that, I would search for a single keyword in quotation marks with the author's name. Using the quotation marks tells Amazon to bring back books that have that phrase in that exact order somewhere in its metadata, and adding the author's name just kept me from having to sort through like 40 plus pages of results to find that a book was or wasn't there. So for this book, on the left is a successful search like this for a book that had social control of business as a keyword. And when I searched for that in quotation marks with the author's name, I only get this one result, which is my book. So that keyword was successful. On the right, and by the same author, is a book without keywords. I don't know if you can see it. It's called Without a Map, Political Tactics and Economic Reform in Russia. So I felt pretty secure in assuming it was about Russian politics, probably, among other things. But since Russian politics does not exist as a phrase anywhere in its metadata, that search brought up no results. Not very encouraging. Now, obviously, a consumer is not very likely to search this way on Amazon, but this was a good way to verify that the keywords were ingested without any major issues. For some titles, I happened to notice before adding keywords that certain search terms were already getting the book in the results. So for these, to determine the impact of keywords on their discoverability, I made a note of how their rank in the search results changed before and after keywords. So for example, this book, Neighborhood is Refuge, I noticed that environmental justice as a search, again without quotation marks in this case and without the author's name, brought this book up on page 5. And after I added this phrase as a keyword, this book came up on page 1 when I searched for that. This is a much better imitation of how an average Amazon user might search, so it's really, really gratifying to see that a single keyword can sometimes have such a big impact on its own. But of course, not every keyword is going to be this successful on its own, so I also did searches for multiple keywords. This book, Adopting Open Source Software, here are all of its keywords. I picked a few out of here and I strung them together into a feasible search query, and I searched Amazon for how to implement OSS. And this book is the only result. Now again, this is a search without quotation marks in this case, because here quotation marks would have probably brought back 0 results, since this isn't a phrase in the keywords, it's spread out across the keywords field. So this shows you that the keywords are being read independently. They're separated by semicolon delimiters, and they're independent of each other, and there's not really any order-based priority apparent, which is good, because if Amazon was messing up something that basic about keywords, it would be really bad. But it's also definitely worth noting for this book, though, that none of these words appear in the title or the subtitle or the series or the author field, and only OSS appears in this book's description, so this is really, really keywords at work. And if you search Amazon for just one of these keywords, it also illustrates how more keywords increases discoverability. If someone searched on Amazon for OSS, they wouldn't find this book because it's not anywhere in the first 10 pages of results. Even if they searched for open source software, which is actually in this book's title, it's still not in the first 10 pages of results, and no one's going to find it. So if you pair any single keyword with another keyword, or with a word in the title, or with the author's name, all of these are going to yield better results than a single keyword acting alone. And that's exactly how we want keywords to work. That's good news. It's impossible to predict what a user is going to type into the Amazon search bar, and that's not what keywords are there to do. I tend to think of keywords as a sort of word bank that Amazon checks searches against to determine relevancy. So even if someone searches for a phrase that's spread out across your keywords field, or partially in your keywords field and partially in your title, or even sometimes only partially present at all, Amazon is going to find that book. So here's another book, Migration and the Welfare State, and all of its keywords. And I did a search for these in a similar way, but in this case, I picked out only pieces of keywords. So the actual keywords here are global economy, theoretical analysis, and free immigration. But from those, I cherry-picked global immigration analysis, and searching for that on Amazon got this book in the second spot on page 1. This shows what I think of as mix and match keywords, which is that any word that's part of a phrase in the keywords is still viewed as an independent keyword in Amazon. So this illustrates that you probably don't need to repeat a word across multiple phrases because they're acting independently already within the phrase. So I did a few rounds of searches like this, trying to answer those questions. I made notes of what I found. I tweaked keywords between Onyx feeds, and I observed the effects that had. And part of that included creating test cases with certain books and their keywords, trying to answer very specific questions. So I used specific books to find out the character limit, or whether it had one, that Amazon was imposing on keywords, the different forms of America Amazon would or wouldn't recognize as being the same, and also whether Amazon was doing any stemming at all, which would be reducing a word to its base form, so that in theory, if you searched for adopted and adopting, you would get very similar results because Amazon would recognize those both as the base form adopt and base the results from that. So the character limit is something that I stumbled upon by accident. This book, again, Neighborhood is Refuge, here are all of the keywords it was assigned, and you can see it's quite a few. So I mentioned that I did keyword searches for all of the books, and it was during that phase I noticed some of these keywords weren't being found by Amazon, and when I realized they were all at the end of the field, I searched backwards from the end until I found the point where Amazon stopped reading. This was the only book in my 50 that had enough keywords to hit this limit, so I used another book to create an artificial test case and see if the limit would be the same. So my test book was Marketing the Moon, and these are the keywords it originally had. So to get it up to the supposed limit, I added these. And after these went out into Amazon, I found that Amazon stopped reading here. And when I compared this to the results I got from Neighborhood is Refuge, it seemed like it was getting cut off at a slightly different point. You can see that Marketing the Moon was allowed more words and more keywords than Neighborhood is Refuge. However, Neighborhood is Refuge was allowed more characters, whether or not you take into account the spaces in keywords. This is not the spaces between keywords, since our Onyx feed strips out the spaces after a semicolon delimiter, so this is actually the spaces inside of the keyword phrases. So it seems clear here that Amazon is not limiting it based on words or keywords, but it isn't exactly clear what it is basing it on or whether it cares about those spaces. So with only 2 books, it's a really small sample size. I ended up rounding to about 600 total characters, spaces, delimiters, and all for the maximum character limit in Amazon. The BISG recommends capping keywords at 500 characters, and you can see here that by almost every measure, these books were allowed more than 500 characters, so it seems like at least with Amazon, we have a little more wiggle room than that. So the character limit I found by accident, but the variations on a theme of America was on my mind from the beginning as something that I wanted to suss out. So for this book, I originally applied just United States as a keyword and no other forms, and then I searched for the other forms in Amazon to see if this book would come up based on any other variant. What I found was that Amazon could find this book based on United States as a keyword if I searched for United States, of course, US or USA, but not if I searched for US with punctuation or for America. So then I updated the keywords and I changed United States to US, because if that caught everything that United States caught, that's fewer characters, and that would be ideal. And I also added America because for this book, it seemed like an important search term to capture. So I saw that this one was functioning the same as United States. It captured United States, US, and USA, and obviously America now, so it was only not capturing US with punctuation. So when I put that on another book, I found that that caught USA and US, but not United States, and still not America. So at this point, it was clear that certain variations were being recognized as the same and certain of them weren't, and the associations weren't always lining up exactly, but I could say at this point that United States and US would capture the same keyword searches, and US would not capture United States, and none of them would capture all of them, and none of them would capture America. This is really frustrating. I think you're laughing because you realize that. Very frustrating, because if you want to capture all the different ways somebody might search for this, you're going to include a lot of characters that you really shouldn't have to do. It's just not efficient. So this was very frustrating. I did not like finding this. But it felt a little self-absorbed to come to Toronto and talk about just America, America, America. So this month I used a few books that weren't in my original search test set, and I looked up variations on a Canadian theme. I found out from Wikipedia that there are about 8 different ways to talk about French Canadians. So I used these 3 different sets of keywords and I tested out which ones would be recognized the same and which ones wouldn't, just like I tested the American examples. I did these searches on Amazon.ca as well as Amazon.com, and the results were virtually the same in both places. And I don't think anyone will be surprised to learn that none of these words had any relationship to any of the others for Amazon. Sorry, guys. Moving right along. Another problem that I was really surprised to encounter was a problem with stemming. I went into this whole thing with the assumption that Amazon's search engine would be sophisticated enough to recognize a base form of a word and associate other forms with it, but that ended up not being the case. This book had the keywords media computing and computational photography, so given what we know about Amazon mixing and matching keywords, I thought that I could search for media computation and find this book, but that was not true. Based on those 2 keywords, Amazon could find this book if I searched for computer, compute, or computes, but if I used the term computed or computation, Amazon did not find this book. These were not in quotation marks, obviously, but I used enough other keywords that I was getting 0 results when it didn't work. So it was very clear that Amazon was recognizing some of these variations and not recognizing others. And there's no clear pattern. If anyone here sees a pattern, let me know. I don't know why Amazon is doing this. But to add even more inconsistency and frustration to this, I found that when I checked these results again this month, it had changed for the worse. So now Amazon is only recognizing computer in addition to the 2 that are explicitly in the keywords. And honestly, it might just recognize computer because this book is in the computers and technology category. So when I saw this, I did go back and check some other books that had similar problems, and they were all still working. So this is the only book I could definitively say the keywords are now performing worse. But this, the whole issue of stemming is a problem mainly because it's so inconsistent. Like I said, there's no pattern to it. But this example really highlights the issue of inconsistency as something that goes beyond the problem of stemming. This problem might be resolved tomorrow, back to its original state or better. There's just no way to know, and anything about Amazon can change in a moment. This is a good time to COA and say that anything in this presentation is liable to change at the whim of Amazon. Where I could, I did go back and I double-checked my results, but in a lot of cases, I had made the necessary changes to improve keyword performance at the time, and so now I can't duplicate the problems I encountered. But yeah, suffice it to say that this is incredibly frustrating. So after I had done my basic searches and done my test cases over several rounds of Onyx, I compiled some additional findings, and some of it is pretty basic, like Amazon does not care about singular or plural terms. Amazon doesn't care about capitalization. It doesn't care about hyphens. All these different ways of writing a compound word is going to get basically the same results in Amazon with a little bit of variation for exact title matches. And actually, when I showed this slide to my boss at work, this is just an example, but her immediate response was, "Do we have a book with doghouse as a keyword?" And no, we don't. I've also talked about how there's no order-based priority in the field and Amazon can mix and match keywords. So from that, I concluded that basically all keywords are created equal in the eyes of Amazon, as long as you don't go over the character limit, because then it's every keyword for itself. I've talked a little bit too about problems that I encountered, both expected and unexpected, but one thing that I haven't talked about yet is missing keywords. For some of my books, there would inexplicably be keywords not read by Amazon, and this was not caused by hitting the character limit. It was often happening to 3 or 4 words in a row in the middle of the keywords field, and everything around it functioned correctly. These keywords were in Vendor Central. I could see them. There was no reason for them not to be working, but they weren't working. Luckily, in almost every case, this was resolved within a few days, inexplicably, without me doing anything. But for one book, this is still a problem, and it's been 7 months now. The keywords are still not registering. I couldn't find any reason for this. Thankfully, it seems like it's rare, and in almost every case, it'll be resolved. Of course, you might think that maybe Amazon is reading the keywords field and weeding out ones that aren't as relevant as others, but if that's the case, then Amazon really needs to update their criteria, because I've seen it happen to very on-point keywords, like high school on a book about computer science programs in high school. And for the book that is still missing keywords after 7 months, one of those keywords appears in that book's description, which seems like that should be enough to make it relevant. So in the end, I did eventually figure out what Amazon was doing with our keywords. What I figured out, unfortunately, was that it is incredibly inconsistent. It's very frustrating. There's nothing we can do about it, and everything is terrible, basically. But in the face of all of that, in the face of the pessimism, I came through and I came up with some sort of additional tips and tricks to tack onto the best practices to just try to make the best of things. So, of course, I talked about the character limit, and that's something you definitely want to be aware of. There is no order-based priority, like I've said before, but if your keywords field is running long, it's obviously definitely a good idea to front-load it with the most relevant or most high-profile keywords, the real breadwinners, so that in case you do hit that limit, nothing super critical is going to get cut off. For the problem of stemming, that one, because it's so inconsistent, I personally don't think it's worth really bothering about. It's almost impossible, but technically doable. However, it would take a lot of time and effort to figure out which different forms of which different keywords Amazon will recognize and which ones it won't. But even if you did do that, you would hit the character limit so fast. By trying to include all of those, you would edge out a lot of vital keywords. So my recommendation on this is to just pick 1 or 2 that you think are the most likely to be searched and include those, and leave the rest to the user. I personally like to think that in general, the world's level of tech savviness is fairly okay and getting better. So most people, if they search for image computing and they don't like the books they see there, they'll try to search for image computation. And that's about the best that we can hope for in this case. Now, obviously, in some cases, you can expect that Amazon won't make the connection, so it's definitely worth including things like synonyms, variations, abbreviations, alternate spellings, things like that. But again, you don't want to fill up the keywords field with these, so if you have a lot, put them at the end. And you can also just check Amazon for changes, because like I mentioned, there are some issues that get resolved without you doing anything at all. And Amazon also can change. Amazon is a very large company, and they are always updating themselves, improving their algorithms. Their search engine will change, and something that worked or didn't work before might now be the exact opposite, like the inconsistent stemming example I showed you. For the variations of US, I was not content to accept what I found, and since there was no single keyword that would capture all of them, I turned to Google Trends to see which forms were being the most searched by people, because it made sense to me that what someone typed into Amazon would probably be the same as what they typed into Google. So according to Google, most people are searching for US, America, and USA, and far, far fewer people are searching for United States, presumably because it takes too long to type, or for US with punctuation. So since we know that US captures USA and also United States, the most efficient way to do this would be to include US and America as keywords, and by doing that, you capture all the search terms except for US with punctuation, which is the least commonly searched of all. I would also recommend including American as needed if that's important for your book, since Amazon stemming does not equate America and American. I also looked at the Google Trends data for the Canadian examples that I had, and while there weren't any surprises here from Amazon, which was bad, there also weren't any surprises from Google Trends, which is good. So while there might be 8 different ways to refer to French Canadians, people are only really using the predictable ones, Canadian, and to a lesser extent, Quebecois. So in this case, while there are a lot of options, it's very easy to predict what a user is going to search and to compensate for that and include these in your keywords. And I also want to say that these results held true when I limited the Google Trends results to searches from Canada and even further to searches within Quebec. So to wrap up then, I promised to talk a little bit about the impact we saw on sales for these 50 titles. After the project had officially concluded, we went back and we compared the sales data from 6 months immediately before keywords were added to the 6 months immediately after the keywords were added. And what we saw overall was a 20% increase in total unit sales for all 50 books. More than half of these books saw some increase in sales, which is incredibly impressive since they were chosen because they were struggling for the most part. And of those that saw an increase, 70% had sales that went up by 50% or more. When we looked at results specifically from Amazon.com, there were several titles that stood out as having jumped drastically in their unit sales. This chart's pretty self-explanatory, showing before keywords to after keywords, unit sales on Amazon. But to me, the most striking piece of metadata on this chart is the publication years. One of these books is from 2010, and 2 are from 2012. And for the kind of book that we publish at MIT Press, seeing this kind of spike in sales is almost unheard of this long after publication, when there's been no other marketing push, there have been no current events generating new interest in these books, the authors haven't published anything else in the time period we were looking at. This is because of keywords for these books. So obviously we were very pleased with these results, but of course there were the titles that did not see increased sales. But we think it's likely in this case that those books still did get a positive impact from the keywords on their discoverability and probably also on their sales, just not to the extent that it pulled them out of a downward trend. And like I mentioned before, these titles were chosen for this project because they were struggling. So the fact that any of them, let alone more than half, saw increased sales makes this a true keyword success story. This is my final slide, and it just shows the 50 books that I was working with on this project. These are the 50 books that were the first to have keywords at MIT Press, so they're near and dear to my heart, and I know them way better than I ever really wanted to, considering some of them are very technical. But since we concluded our research on this, we've since implemented a keywords workflow that spans 4 departments at the press, and we're working now to cultivate a general culture of inclusivity and participation in keywords as a whole. And as of right now, our entire front list moving forward will have keywords applied to them. And with that, I will open it up to questions.
Hi, Barbara Housen from House of Anansi. When you're searching for Quebecois, did you do it without the accents, and did that make a difference?
I tried it both ways, and I did not see that it made a difference. I feel like that's pretty similar to Amazon not caring about hyphens and capitalization. Those kind of character marks are not being considered.
Did you find did you try not using delimiters at all, and whether that had any impact?
No, I didn't try. You mean not at all in the entire keywords field?
Yeah, just not at all.
No, that didn't occur to me to try. As far as I'm aware, they're not being counted as characters, so I don't see where including or not including would have much of an impact overall on anything. But that would be interesting. If you try it, let me know.
Can you tell us more about the metadata workflow that you've implemented since you started this project?
Sure. We actually just rolled out the final phase of it to our last department, sales and marketing, this week. It starts, though, with the author and with acquisitions. We're collecting keywords to the best of our ability, sometimes they're stubborn, from the authors themselves, since they know their books the best. And since our books are super technical, they often are very familiar with their audiences, so they're a great resource for keywords. If the authors don't provide keywords, the acquisitions editors are supplying them or enhancing the ones from the authors. And then I go in personally, and I'm working on phasing myself out of the workflow, but right now I'm checking for basic formatting issues and areas for enhancement. Sometimes people will put a word in the keywords that's already in the title, and then I have to slap their wrist. But from me, it goes on to our editorial assistant, who's in charge of CIP data. As CIP data comes back from Library of Congress, she looks at the keywords, and if subject headings might be useful keywords, those get added in. And from there, it goes to sales and marketing, finally, where they monitor a book after it's published, and as we all know, keywords can benefit from being updated at any point in their life cycle, so we're really counting on sales and marketing to be aware of these books, of how they're doing in the marketplace, how people are talking about them, how they're being received, awards they're getting, if there's any new media buzz about them, and we're relying on them to go back and look at those keywords again in these situations. But I want to say, too, that we have our keywords field. There are no permissions limiting it. We use a title management software through FileMaker, and there's permissions for each field, but everyone at the press has access to the keywords, and as part of that culture we're trying to foster, we want everyone to feel like they can contribute to it.
Hi. Are you familiar with Amazon TSKs by any chance?
No.
They're Amazon-specific keywords that you can send them in an Excel file that are related to the browse nodes.
Oh, no.
And they're just like this weird creature that have no control. I was just wondering if you had any experience with them, but sadly not.
No, I haven't. I think we used to use Excel at the press, but that was long, long before my time. I've been there less than a year right now, so I haven't.
Keywords as well. It's just those are another thing that they have.
Do you use the keywords by sending them through Excel?
We send them through Onyx.
Oh, okay. If we're receiving those, they're not coming across my desk, but I'm going to ask about that.
I'm wondering about the stemming. If you take a word like parenting or parenthood, if you use the root of that, the parent, did you find that it would pick that up as a subset?
I didn't use I didn't use the specific parenting example, but in general, no. I found that it was different for every different word, what forms it picked up and what it didn't.
So based on the experiences that you had determining what keywords were working and not working for you, have you considered constructing a sort of standardized vocabulary that you can at least pull from to start off the metadata tagging process?
Like a standardized list of suggested keywords?
Yeah, like a taxonomy for your...
Well, we're right now in the final stages of implementing a brand new internal subject taxonomy it's going to be used internally, but it's also going to influence the browse on our own personal website. And we currently have a less effective system that's similar to that, and we have our BISAC codes visible in the same tabs where we keep our keywords. So all of these things we hope are impacting keywords are definitely things that I look at when I'm double checking the keywords or adding new keywords to backlist titles. So there's an awareness of that, but I don't think it would be super helpful to have a set list of keywords. We really want it to be specific to the book, because especially since we publish trade and we publish technical manuscripts, we publish textbooks, so the kind of language that's going to be needed for every book is also varying widely.